Good morning. Each Sunday during September before the sermon, I'm going to be offering a perspective on our human relationship with creation. Today I want to begin by telling the creation story from a scientific standpoint, which I believe sits comfortably with the Genesis account. We are made of stardust. From dust we come and to dust we will return. Startling, sobering, but true. We humans are the result of an extraordinary series of miracles, beginning with the birth and death of stars. The miracle and gift of human life is beyond our comprehension, and our shared responsibility for the care of earthly creation is immeasurably great. So let's consider very briefly what science has revealed about where we and the creation that we are part of have come from. The universe that we inhabit, including time and space, sprang into existence 14 billion years ago, in a tiny fraction of a second, in the Big Bang. Before that, there was nothing but God. In that first moment, the very nature of matter and energy, and thus the forces that shape physical reality, was determined. It could have been a little different, this way or that, and this universe wouldn't exist. Things were very hot at first. After they cooled a lot, stable atoms of the element hydrogen formed. Then, after hundreds of millions of years, the first stars formed from vast clouds of hydrogen gas. Gravity pulled together clusters of stars to form galaxies. Nuclear reactions in these stars gradually burnt up the hydrogen to form helium. And then, after billions of years, the stars either collapsed into a much smaller and very dense type of star, or they exploded most spectacularly, if someone was there to see it, in a supernova, a bright flash in a corner of the universe. The upshot was that the other 90 natural elements of the 92 were formed from various types of star collapses and explosions. Younger generations of stars and the planets that often orbit them have more diverse chemistries than derived from the dust of older stars. Such is the case with the planet Earth. In addition to hydrogen, it has an abundance of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, calcium, sulfur, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, silicon, iron, phosphorus, copper, etc., on which either our bodies or the suitability of the Earth for life depends. So, the Earth was formed from a hot cloud of exploded stardust exactly 4.567 billion years ago, orbiting a new medium-sized star just far enough out from it that liquid water could exist in the so-called Goldilocks zone. Gradually, the dense clouds of water vapour turned to rain and the oceans filled. We'll hear that little echo there of Genesis account. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere that we now breathe. There was a great deal of carbon dioxide and methane, two gases now known as greenhouse gases because they trap much of the heat rising from the Earth's surface. Great cracks opened the Earth's surface and magma pushed up from its depths, forming volcanoes, eventually land. It's possible that the first life first came into existence in a hot, watery brew, spewing out from volcanic vents like the white smokers that still occur along oceanic ridges, albeit under quite special physical and chemical conditions. Life was very simple at first, but soon colonies of bacteria forming mats inhabited shallow seas. And I have visited fossils of these stromatolite mats, 3.5 billion years old, a quarter of the age of the universe, in the Pilbara in northern Australia. Here is this life, 3.5 billion years old. Early life appears to have used sulfur or methane rather than carbon dioxide to provide chemical energy. However, around 2.4 billion years ago, suddenly there was a rapid increase in oxygen in the atmosphere, signalling that photosynthetic plants, able to consume carbon dioxide and release oxygen in the process, had evolved. It was about 640 million years ago that multicellular animal life appeared. Fossils of these creatures were first discovered at Ediacara in the Flinders Ranges in the 1940s. Immediately before the appearance of these complex organisms, the Earth was almost entirely engulfed in ice in an event known as Snowball Earth, evidence of which also comes from the Flinders Ranges. Just how Earth escaped this icy hell is uncertain, but the event does seem to have set the stage for the dramatic evolution of plant-animal life since then. So a lot has happened since then. As you might know, the dinosaurs were mostly wiped out as a result of a huge asteroid hitting the Earth about 65 million years ago. And birds are the only dinosaur descendants to survive. Fast forwarding to us, Homo sapiens appears to have evolved from earlier humans in Africa at least 200,000 years ago. After modern humans dispersed from Africa and populated the Middle East, Europe and Asia, Aboriginals arrived in Australia around 70,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, during low sea levels in the most recent Ice Age, Aboriginals were able to walk from the mainland Australia to Tasmania. 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. The seas rose and Bass Strait created a barrier. Port Phillip Bay only filled with water 8,000 years ago. And here we are, heading towards 8 billion people inhabiting one Earth, compared to 1 billion in 1800. Since 1800, science has propelled technological change. We've had the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, global trade and modern medicine, megacities and global tourism. And as we enjoy an extraordinary material quality of life, the life systems of the Earth that have evolved over the past 4 billion years are under severe assault. The oceans and forests have been plundered, wetlands drained, rivers polluted and compromised, soils degraded, while biodiversity is in rapid retreat. Importantly, in our lifetimes, the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases, which were there at the beginning, in the atmosphere, have immeasurably impacted the climate and will continue to do so. So great is our collective impact in transforming the Earth's surface that the current geological period is now identified as the Anthropocene. To end, a poem. In the beginning, the living stone was all there was, a speck of dust, the one true spark of hope, of joy, of love, bringing light into being, giving form to nothingness, awakening all that might be. Your breath roared forth, causing darkness to retreat, stars and worlds to multiply, waves to stroke the land, grasses to cloak the earth, children to shriek with delight. Later, in the silence of that Christ night, all that could be heard was creation singing, erupting with joy not known since time began. Cows and angels, shepherds and cherubim, cicadas and olive trees, the land and seas themselves, the heart of every creature under heaven.
A few years ago, I was in the UK and I visited a small stone church in the Peak District, which is north of Manchester. A small parish church whose foundation was over 700 years. This church was taking part, this parish was taking part, as all parishes in the Church of England were at the time, taking part in an energy audit for all its buildings. In this case, the parish buildings comprised this one small church. The Church of England was urging all parishes and Anglican entities to reduce their energy consumption. And this church had replied on the form that had been given that it had the following energy usage. One electric light bulb, candles to supplement the light when necessary, one cold tap, which was in the church yard, and when it was very cold, as it is in the Peak District, parishioners brought their own hot water bottles or heated bricks. I've actually only heard of heated bricks in Victorian novels, but they wrote in their reply that this was their total energy consumption, but that if the Church of England commissioners had any other suggestions for reducing their energy consumption, they would take those on board. I think this represents a kind of one end point of understanding of the issues of the environment and commitment to being stewards of creation. At the other end, we do have Christians who don't really have any particular interest in issues of the care of creation. And we have a great many secular environmentalists strongly committed to concerns of conservation, but not coming from a religious belief background. In fact, environmentalists do say that the scriptures, and in particular Genesis 1 and 2, are responsible for the extreme exploitation of our earth, which is apparent today, and that this exploitation comes about because of an arrogance on the part of Christians towards nature. They look particularly and use as evidence a very famous verse which we heard read in our first reading today, Genesis 1:28 to be exact. If you have your reading sheet, it is at the beginning of the second paragraph in the reading from the book of Genesis, where it says, male and female he created them, and then it says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Critics of the Judeo-Christian tradition in this regard point to the words subdue, that humans are called on to subdue the earth and to have dominion over it. As I said, Christians choose to have a different interpretation and to take their inspiration from this verse. So this is hotly contested territory. And I want to speak a little bit about that. The environmentalists claim that if what God is calling us to be relates to subduing and having dominion, that this cannot be marked by a cherishing of the environment, not by a careful stewardship. It will lead to exploitation and a disregard for anything other than human needs and interests, for anything other than human greed. It feeds into human greed. Now, at first sight, we need to say that this verse does appear uncompromising in its meaning. The Hebrew word for subdue is kavash, and the main use of the word kavash is to make a slave. Describes the forcing of another person into a subordinate position. That's its most common use. It's about overpowering. It's also used to describe military conquest, the kavash of by the Israelite people of their enemies. And the Hebrew for the other word, dominion, is radar. Humans are to have dominion, radar, over all living things. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, radar is employed to describe the rule of a household leader over servants, or the officers of the king's army over the ordinary soldiers. Radar signifies power and control and authority of one individual or group over another. But as always with the Bible, we need to take a lot of care over our interpretation of the text. The question always is, what was it that the writer understood God was saying? If we look through a lens now of 2,000 years later, what greater perspective can we bring to bear on perhaps what it was that the writer understood God meant? The first thing we need to do is look very carefully at how the word radar or dominion is spoken about elsewhere. Yes, it is about dominion, but in the book of Leviticus, it says that household slaves are not to have radar imposed on them harshly. The dominion is to be kind and humane in nature. So what the Old Testament is telling us here is that there's a moral choice to be made about how we exercise dominion, how we exercise radar. The other thing that's very important to remember, and Trevor alluded to this, is that our Bible comes from the period well before the Industrial Revolution. And for humankind, the period before the Industrial Revolution, with its requirement to live from subsistence agriculture, was precarious, much more precarious than our lives are now. Remember, there were no high-yielding crops, no effective insecticides, little irrigation. Starvation was really just another bad season away. This is the common history of all humankind. It's not difficult to understand in that context how the relationship of humankind to the earth would come to be viewed quite adversarially. How the human task of producing food would be regarded as a kind of overpowering of intractable ground, of gaining an upper hand over the earth, of subduing the earth, or the Kadash of the earth. It's easy to see why biblical writers would hold that view of the relationship of humans to the earth. The belief in subduing and dominion arose not really out of contexts of human power, but out of the context of human powerlessness. For a biblical society, as for most of the history of humankind, the balance of power seemed to be definitely in nature's favour. The Jewish people could not have envisaged the kind of control of nature that is now possible for humankind after the industrial and technological revolutions. But unlike the early Israelites, we now have considerable technological power. What we can do can impact enormously on the environment in a way that our forebears could never have imagined. So in some sense, we do have dominion over the earth, and we can subdue the earth in ways that would have been unimaginable even a few generations ago. So we need to look at Genesis 1:28, asking ourselves, how is it that we should exercise this dominion? And we are clear from the biblical text elsewhere that rada dominion should be exercised kindly and benevolently rather than harshly or unthinkingly. There is a choice here. It is not good enough to take a simple translation of the word rada into dominion and to say, that is how we will act. That's not what the biblical text is really saying to us. The other thing that we know from Genesis 1 is that we are part of the created order of God. We may indeed be able to subdue the earth through technology, but we don't operate outside the laws of nature. They are not suspended for us. It is possible for us to damage the environment beyond any conceivable easy repair and to suffer for it. We need a proper humility, otherwise we will diminish the wonderful world that God has made for us. We now have that capacity, but we are not lords of the universe. God is the Lord of the universe. And he has made us in his own image. And his image, God, is love and power that is never exercised through violence. The power of God is never exercised through violence. It is exercised through powerlessness. We are made in that image, and that tells us about what our relationship should be with one another and with the earth. We are called to be stewards of the creation, carers and lovers of the creation, so that we reflect the love of God who created us. Now, the book of Genesis is sacred scripture for Jews as well as for Christians, and Jewish scholars have pondered on this verse a great deal as they ponder issues around environmentalism. I'd like to offer what's called a targum, written recently by a liberal Jewish rabbi. A targum is a paraphrase of a part of the Bible, or sometimes an expansion of it, to meet a contemporary need for understanding. We don't quite do that in Christianity, but it's quite common among Jewish scholars. So this rabbi suggests that we think of God's command to us in Genesis 1:28 in the following way. God said, "Be fruitful and have children, filling the earth with your life so that you can have power to fight against everything in it that leads to death. Rule with care and fairness over the natural world, over the myriads of my beautiful creatures, from tropical fish to soaring eagles to dogs and cats, every creature that is a part of this living world. Be faithful stewards for me." The Lord be with you.